In the early 1700s, with just half a century passed after the Great Fire of London burned down a third of the city, a rapid growth in population, advancement in architecture and science, and the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire, dangerous opportunities bloom on the streets of London. In this interim between devastation and revival, only the most audacious would reap the highest rewards. One of these daring entrepreneurs of fortune was Jack Sheppard, coming from nothing and making it into the public imagination of London. His life gave rise to a whole tradition of literature, plays and burlesques, inspiring artists and writers such as Daniel Defoe, John Gay, William Hogarth, and William Harrison Ainsworth with his anarchic crimes and complete flaunting of the authorities. So in the early 1700s, it's just half a century after the Great Fire of London. You can imagine that changed London quite a bit. So the whole of London had been reshaped. It had gone from these very narrow wooden buildings to much wider lanes, but they still quickly constructed to get everyone home. So the landscape went from very narrow alleyways to very broad ways instead. And that, of course, would set its mark in London. It gave rise to new opportunities to people, because it was an unprecedented era of new opportunities, population growth, science and technological advancement. People that had the chance and the will could absolutely make something out of themselves. And Jack was one of those people. So this is the story of a real Robin Hood figure of the 18th century. And he would have been born here in White's Row. So this is where he began his early life. Jack Sheppard, he started out as a common carpenter and he made his way up onto the stage of celebrity, becoming a petty thief and finally working his way into literature and the public imagination of people around him. Through his short but adventurous life, we can get a really good glimpse into the Georgian era and the criminal underbelly of this time. Because his father died when he was young, his mother couldn't support their family. He was the one who came with a main wage before, so Jack had to be sent off to a workhouse. Now, this workhouse in Bishopsgate was called Mr. Garrett's School, and there he would work about 12 hours a day. That was the conditions of most workhouses. So the children had little time but to do anything but eat or sleep or work. The idea was that the children would be taught proper virtues of industriousness and honesty, and of course, as well, proper subordination to their betters. So up here we've got Cheapside. This is where all the traders and a lot of the craftsmen of the area would be back in Jack's time, back in the Georgian era. So Jack would have started his adult life up here, where his mother jockeyed him from position to position. So first he was in the employ of two cane makers. The first one died early, and the other one, he treated him badly. He was beating him. So he was quickly transferred from that to a William Kneebone, who was a wool draper who taught him how to read and write. And he was a shop boy for him, probably up where here somewhere in Cheapside. And then through Kneebone, he finally got a position as an apprentice to a carpenter called Owen Woon. That was the beginning of Jack's life, and for the first 5 years of his apprenticeship, he was an honest and hard-working apprentice. He would also come to be known as Honest Jack, but that would have very different connotations later on. The streets would have been about this narrow here. Not a lot of streets were very wide, so that's more of a modern phenomenon that we have. So Bodine gives you a good idea what the streets would have looked like if you go down here. And we've got St. Mary le Bow. You can hear the bells coming from it up there. They say that if you're born within earshot of those bells, then you can consider yourself a true cockney or a true working class. And Jack was definitely part of the working class. That was part of his popularity. Apprentices were notorious for being a rowdy and unruly lot, especially after they had finished their work and were free to roam the streets.
Many worked under poor conditions, sleeping on boards placed on the junctions of beams in the ceilings of their masters' shops. Many more were ill-treated, as Jack was with his second master, suffering brutal punishments and violent behavior. For some, this life of toil and servitude didn't suit their tempers. It would soon turn out that honest Jack was to count among that itinerant number. With less than a year left of his training to become a recognized carpenter, Jack had already mastered most of the skills of his trade and was quickly led on to a much more exciting and prosperous path.
Right, so here in Drury Lane, there were lots of taverns and bars around, and this is where Jack started frequenting in his spare time as an apprentice. Now, he met a guy called Joseph Hayne. He was a button molder who owned a tavern called the Black Lion. And it's in the Black Lion that Jack would make a lot of his new acquaintances. He would meet lots of new friends in the criminal underworld. Unbeknownst to him, it was a hive of criminal masterminds, such as Jonathan Wild, the thief-taker general, and what would later be his partner in crime, Blueskin Blake. And it's also where he met Elizabeth Lyon, better known as Edgeworth Bess. She was a lady of the night who first spurred him on the path to become a thief. According to his own autobiography, she was the one who first encouraged him to start doing petty little thievery here and there. And that all started here in Drury Lane.
Wild plied a cunning trade of his own, with one foot firmly planted on the side of the law and the other in crime. Through a rigorous education as a prisoner in Newgate Prison, he learned the ins and outs of all sorts of crime, and quickly became a leader and employer of thieves of every stripe. This led him to fabricating an empire, or his corporation of thieves, people that he promised he could keep out of the clutches of the law, until they crossed him, that was. As soon as one turned against him, or the reward was simply too much to resist, he would hand them on a silver platter to the government and collect his £40 reward. For reference, the average annual wage of a labourer was £30, so this was quite substantial. Considering that Jack's wage would have been about the same amount, all his carousing would naturally take a toll on his finances and apprenticeship, causing tensions between him and Owen Wood. At Bess's urging, and no doubt the social pressure of his new friend, Jack took to petty theft. His first recorded act of crime was in the spring of 1723, shoplifting 2 silver spoons. Gradually, as his confidence grew, he began progressing to larger crimes, such as burglary, with the gangs under Jonathan Wild, fencing many of his goods to his corporation of thieves.
So here we are in St. Giles, roughly between Holborn and Charing Cross Road. And this is where the friend of Jack Shepherd, Edgeworth Bess, she was locked up after a failed attempt to pickpocket a diamond ring from one of her customers. Now in these times, there weren't a whole lot of deterrents for criminals, except if they actually got caught. But the few forces around here, they were not that effective. Sheriffs and deputies and constables, they were very corrupt. They were usually underpaid, easy to bribe them or have them look the other way. And otherwise you relied on the mob and hue and cry to capture your thieves. But when Bess was caught, Jack decided he needed to get her free. It was surprisingly easy for him. He could just walk straight into the tower and force the beadle to give him the keys and get her straight out. Now, he was probably growing confident because of not being caught in many of his crimes, because authorities weren't very effective at doing that. But he did catch the attention of someone else, called the attention of Jonathan Wild, who was probably the most effective thief catcher around here in London, even though he was little more than a criminal himself.
He sent James Sykes, known as Hell and Fury, to have a game of skittles with Jack. When they met for the game, Jack was immediately apprehended by a parish constable in St. Giles and brought to St. Giles's roundhouse, the very place he had broken Edgeworth Bess out from before. It took him about 3 hours to break through the roof, using a razor to cut out the stretcher of a chair and beating the roof with it. He used his featherbed mattress to muffle the sounds of falling debris from his work, and after completing his breach, made it to the roof. He discovered he couldn't make it all the way down safely, so he went back to his room and fashioned a rope from his bed linens. Lowering himself down, a large crowd had gathered at the commotion. To distract them, he pointed up to the rooftops and shouted that he had seen a man in irons running up there, and while everyone eagerly pointed and shouted, he slipped away into the crowd.
So, in 1724, 19th of May, Jack was caught stealing again. This time in Leicester Fields, close to present-day Leicester Square, where he attempted a bit of pickpocketing. But as you'll soon learn about Jack, he was not necessarily the best thief all the time. He was seen by the whole crowd when he snatched a watch out of the man's hand and tried to dart away. And the crowd caught him, and he was soon thrown in jail again, this time in St. Anne's Roundhouse in Soho. Now, he was visited by Edgeworth Bess, the woman who had first gotten him into crime. She got into prison and tried to help him out a little bit. She brought the spike of a halberd that she smuggled in her dress and attempted to give to him so he could use it as a tool to break out once again. Unfortunately, she was recognized by the guards there, and she was thrown in prison with him. So now they got to share a cell together as husband and wife. And they were actually moved to a different prison to await justice, so they were brought here to a new prison in Clerkenwell. And it was down here then that they had to find a new plan for escape. So, in here, they were now in new prison, and they had to find a new plan to get out, a little bit further behind us here. So their friends were smuggling in tools for them, and gradually over the next 6 days, they managed to file through their fetters, break through a window and hoist themselves down using their bedclothes and bed linens as an improvised rope. Now, they unfortunately ended up in the courtyard of this building that used to be a house of correction, Bridewell. So there was, of course, a very large wall around that. It was also a workhouse where children, like Jack had been in his own childhood, were worked to the bone. Later on, in later history, it turned into a mental ward, so it's always got a bit of a history to it of wanting to keep people in. And that was as much as Jack discovered, because he was now facing a 22-foot tall wall. Now that's quite a bit taller than this one here, so it would be quite the feat to manage to get across that wall. But he actually managed to scale it with Edgeworth Bess. They were using a gate for purchase, and also used the broken manacles and fetters from before as purchase points for the wall. And he actually managed to climb over the wall with Bess in his arms, supposedly. Now, when they came to freedom and this news spread all over London, his fame rose to new heights, because not only had he himself escaped this time, but he had also, in a very gentleman fashion, brought out a lady at the same time. He was a very small man too. She was a larger, more buxom woman. So the feat was even more astonishing that he had managed to carry her across this incredibly tall wall to freedom.
Jack started working with Joseph Blueskin Blake, who soon became a good friend of his, and another of Jonathan's men, who he burglarized more homes and shops with, even going into a brief foray as highwaymen together. With most of his old ties shattered, he had no qualms about robbing his old master William Kneebone, the wool draper who had initially taught him literacy. But while his old allegiances were all but gone, he gained increasing admiration in the criminal underworld, Jonathan Wild included, the man who had organized his first arrest. Wild demanded that Jack surrendered his stolen goods for him to fence, but the carpenter gone rogue refused, and thereby earned Wild's ire. Where he had previously been motivated by greed, now things had gotten personal, and he couldn't allow Jack to act with impunity outside of his corporation, so he began to seek his arrest. And he knew one of his weaknesses. Jonathan found Edgeworth Bess and started plying her with drinks in the brandy shop of Temple Bar. At first, she was reluctant to reveal Jack's whereabouts, but she eventually submitted after enough coaxing and drinking. He sent one of his henchmen, Quild Arnold, who arrested Jack on the 23rd of July, 1723, at the brandy shop of Blueskin's mother. For the third time, he was imprisoned and awaiting trial, this time incarcerated in Newgate Prison, near the Old Bailey.
Here he faced 3 charges of theft, but he was acquitted of the first 2 due to lack of evidence. On the third, however, he had 3 people that went against him. One was Jonathan Wild, who had had a personal vendetta against him for a while. The other was William Kneebone, who was his former master that he had stolen the goods from. And finally, the last person to give evidence against him was William Field, who was the fence he had sold the goods to. Unbeknownst to Jack, William Field was another pawn of Jonathan Wild, so he had sold his goods to the wrong man, and that had resulted in 3 people giving very convincing evidence against him. The conviction was death by the noose, one of the most common punishments of the day, or as the locals they like to call it, dangling in the sheriff's picture frame. On the day his death warrant arrived, on the 31st of August from Windsor, Jack Sheppard made another brazen escape. This time, he had loosened an iron bar, gradually loosened it from his window, and then he was being visited by his old flame, Edgeworth Bess, and one of her friends, Paul Maggot. Bess no doubt felt guilt about delivering his information before to Jonathan Wild and came to his rescue this time. So while they distracted the guards, he could pry out the iron bar, slip through the gap that it afforded. He was very small, so he could actually get through that gap fairly easily. Once he was through, Bess and Paul, they brought him women's clothes that they had smuggled in through their dresses, dressed him up as a woman, and he could walk out scot-free.
In the meantime, Jack's reputation had skyrocketed. He was now a beloved figure of the common man, and especially the working class, a constant show of rebellion and affront to the established powers. Handsome, from low birth, non-violent, and seemingly able to escape punishment at will, it was no small wonder. This time, the wardens had learned from their previous mistakes. Jack was placed in the middle stone room of Newgate Prison, where he could be watched at all times, in a part of the prison best described as a hellhole, a most fearful, sad, deplorable place. Hell itself in comparison cannot be such a place. There is neither bench, stool, nor stick for any person there. They lie like swine upon the ground, upon one another, howling and roaring. At this point, his fame had reached new heights, and he became an object of curiosity in his cell in Newgate Prison. Clergymen, nobles, and ladies visited him for extortionate fees by the jailer, quizzing him and interviewing him on his life. For most of these visits, he was reportedly sarcastic and witty, refusing to answer any question in a serious spirit. He treated the divines that came to save his soul with the same irreverence, calling them gingerbread fellows, which was cant for moneymen. At one point, one of the Lord Mayor's men asked to have him pointed out in the chapel on a Sunday, and Jack immediately called out, "Yes, sir, I am the shepherd, and all the jailers in the town are my flock, and I cannot stir into the country, but they are all at my heels baying after me." At another time, he had a file smuggled in, hidden inside a Bible. When confronted about this, he supposedly said, "One file's worth all the Bibles in the world." Unfortunately, his reputation had the unintended effect of wisening up his supposedly sheepish jailers to his tricks. He was caught twice by the guards, finding files and tools of escape hidden in his cell, and he was transferred to another cell known as the Castle, put in leg irons and stabled to the floor with 2 chains. Another element to his downfall was his growing showmanship. Perhaps spurred on by his fame, he flamboyantly demonstrated how even these constraints were insufficient, showing how he could easily lockpick these confines with but a nail to his boggled capturers. They bound him more tightly and handcuffed him. Meanwhile, in the Old Bailey next door, Blueskin Blake was being convicted as well, sold for slaughter by his former employer, Jonathan Wild. After having pleaded unsuccessfully with Wild for his life, his former employer and William Field, his fence, gave evidence against him. Enraged and hopeless about his situation, Blake attacked Wild in the courtroom with a pocket knife, slashing his throat. Wild barely survived. The uproar from this spread to Newgate Prison, and Jack used this to his full advantage, unlocking his handcuffs with a crooked nail he'd found and kept between his teeth, removing his chains. He was able to twist and break the links of his leg irons to the stables on the floor, and gathered the broken scraps of metal for later tools. Dragging himself along with his leg irons still on, he attempted to climb up through the chimney, but it was blocked by an iron bar. He removed the bar and used it to break into the red room above his cell. Then he worked his way through 5 barred doors, breaking through all the locks and bolts on the way, until he reached the prison chapel. From there, he made it onto an outside wall next to a neighboring house. It was too far down from the rooftop here, so he went all the way back to his previous cell and collected his blankets to make another rope. Come dawn, he was climbing down the side of the building with his rope, narrowly escaping detection from the neighbors, who loudly mistook him for a cat. Another escape, another surge in popularity. Jack once again became the talk of town, and his first biography was advertised in the Daily Journal on the 20th of October, 1724. With his iron still on, he hid in a cowshed near Tottenham Court Road. He caught a bypassing journeyman shoemaker and fed him a lie that he had just escaped from a house of correction, and offered him well over a week's wages to bring him tools. After 2 days in the cowshed and having liberated himself of his irons, he tore up his own clothes and disguised himself as a beggar, free to roam the city at his leisure. Moving about town in his disguise, he caught up on the latest talk about himself, discussing at length with a woman at Piccadilly whether the notorious thief Shepherd would escape. He also found 2 ballad singers and a crowd around them applauding his efforts. After catching up with a new flame of his in a garret he had hired, he broke into a pawnshop owned by 2 brothers called Rawlins in Drury Lane on the 29th of October. They woke up from his rifling of their loot, but he deceived them by loudly pretending there were others there to assist him, instructing his henchmen to shoot the first one to come through the door. Apparently that convinced them to remain in bed. He snagged a black silk suit, a silver sword, snuff boxes and watches, a wig and some cash. As recounted in his autobiography, I made an extraordinary appearance, and from a carpenter, butcher was now transformed into a perfect gentleman, and in company with my sweetheart aforesaid, and another young woman of her acquaintance, went into the city, and were very merry together at a public house not far from the place of my old confinement. He went to all his old haunts, boldly visiting family and friends and flaunting his freedom. Soon enough, he was roaring drunk in a pub when its owner, who happened to be a constable, ordered his arrest. At length my senses were quite overcome with the quantities and varieties of liquors I had all the day been drinking, which paved the way for my fate to meet me. And when apprehended, I do protest, I was altogether incapable of resisting, and scarce knew what they were doing to me, and had but 2 second-hand pistols scarce worth carrying about me. Supposedly, he attempted to use his new silver sword against his assailants, drunkenly swinging it around without much avail. It took little effort for them to haul him back to Newgate Prison. This time, Jack was loaded with 300 pounds of weights to keep him down. Again, he was visited by several people of note, and he always kept a cheerful mood, turning almost anything that was said into banter or jokes. Many couldn't help but admire or pity him, especially since he had never killed anyone in his crimes, and most of them seemed to have been carried out from a sense of devil-may-care attitude rather than malice or greed. The jailers upped the price to see him to 4 shillings, making a fortune. Many of his visitors even gave him money, but since he had no use of it in his current state, he gave it freely to other prisoners who could have more use of it. Some guests even sent petitions to King George I for his release, and Sir James Thornhill, the sergeant painter of the king, came and painted a portrait of him. However, this popularity also made him dangerous in the eyes of some. Others might be inspired to follow his example and make a mockery of the authorities, as he had done over his about 18 months of crime. Should he manage to escape one more time, it would become clear to the poor that the government held little true power over them.
So on the 10th of November, Jack Shepherd was brought here to Westminster Hall. He was brought here to face the Court of the King's Bench, where he would face off against Mr. Justice Powles, who was offering him a deal. If he would inform on his accomplices, they would lighten his sentence from hanging to being transported to America, just like his brother before him. But he declined the offer, saying that they knew all of his accomplices already, because if he decided to be a snitch, that would tar his reputation, and he was fully aware of the reputation he had garnered over his brief time as a thief. He told them that they already knew of his accomplices. There was Tom, his brother, who had started thieving with him early. Edgeworth Bess, she had been there from the beginning and she was currently in prison. William Page, who had been caught with him in Finchley Common. And finally Blueskin Blake, who was awaiting execution himself. And then he said that the only accomplice that had been with him on his last excursion was God. They were shocked at his profanity, and it caused Powles to declare that if he had had any supernatural aid, it could only have been the devil. Now they continued pressing him for information about other accomplices, but he kept rejecting them. And finally, after his stubborn refusal to comply, they decided to sentence him to death. Now when he came out of Westminster Hall, there was such a crowd outside waiting for him that surged forward that a constable trying to keep back the crowd broke his leg. So it tells you something more about his popularity at the time. And then he was sent back to Newgate Prison.
On November the 16th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, he was taken out of Newgate to be hanged. Receiving his last rites in the chapel, he was brought to the press yard to have his fetters removed. Traditionally, the condemned were transported to Tyburn in an open carriage with only their arms bound by a rope that would be tied into the noose. However, with Jack, they decided to make an exception and give him handcuffs instead. He furiously resisted this, but the Under-Sheriff Watson replied sarcastically, "You're an imp of mischief, and it will be impossible to deliver you safely to Tyburn unless you have irons on your wrists." Of course, Jack had had a plan. He had sewn a penknife inside the pocket of his waistcoat, with its blade pointed upwards, allowing him to cut through the rope restraining his hands in secret. Angered at having his plan foiled by this impromptu decision of shackling his wrists with irons, he tried to hit the deputy over the head with the very manacles that had doomed him. The deputy escaped his wrath, and while Jack was restrained, he searched him. It didn't take long for his hand to slip into his pocket, and with a howl he retracted it, bleeding, having cut himself on the hidden knife. Since he had now been discovered, Shepard laughed in delight and told his keepers all about his plans to gradually cut through the ropes binding his arms before he would vault himself over the cart and disappear into the crowd, running through narrow alleyways where horses couldn't pursue him. Now all he could do was to fantasize about his own plan. With the city marshal and the javelin men ahead of his carriage, they moved all the way down from Newgate Prison to Oxford Road, current-day Oxford Street, in a slow parade to Tyburn. As many as 200,000 people attended, which was about a third of London, turning into a celebratory parade of his life. Many men wished to shake his hand and congratulate him on his exploits, and throngs of women cried and gave him flowers as he went past on his carriage. They slowed down the procession to a crawl. For a penny apiece, pamphlets with his unofficial speech were sold to the crowds. It read, "Like Dr. Faustus, I may have my pranks played, by contract with his master long since made. Like him lived gay and revelled in delight, drank all day and whored the livelong night. To raise my name above all the rogues in history, I've made chains, bolts, and bars fly all before me. But hark, the dismal sound, the clock strikes one, the charm is broke, and all my strength is gone. The dragon comes, I hear his hideous roar. Farewell, my friends, for now poor Jack's no more." No doubt performers and desperate actors would have read out loud his speech. Public hangings at this time held a carnival air, with stand-sellers, jugglers, and performers drawn to the great crowds. And even though the gallows were a very real threat to the poor, many made light of the hangings, calling hanging days Sheriff's Ball, and the hanging itself dancing the Paddington Frisk. People also tended to say that hanging itself was nothing more than a wry neck and a wet pair of breeches. On the way, they halted at the City of Oxford Tavern, and Shepard had a pint of sack for his Dutch courage. It was common practice to numb the senses of the captives on their way to a hanging with a final tavern visit, building up their courage to face the hangman, as well as dulling their resistance. Many terms originate from this tradition of hanging. For the almost carnival-like atmosphere of a public execution, many families brought along their own cheap and homemade alcohol, resulting the following day in a hangover. Usually, the hangman would have to stay on the wagon, and was the only one not allowed into the tavern, coining the phrase, "on the wagon." and the tradition of a final drink before execution became known as one for the road. Finally, to help those facing the noose gain a swifter death, friends and family would often pull in their legs when strangulated by the noose, thus pulling your leg. Upon leaving the tavern and returning to his cart, a youth bounded up to him and whispered something in his ear. At hearing this message, Jack reared back his head and laughed, expressing to the reverend who accompanied him, "I have now great satisfaction at heart, as if I was going to enjoy an estate of £200 a year." Perhaps he had been told of Appleby's plan to resuscitate him after his hanging, since this publisher of his autobiography wouldn't want to lose out on a scoop like him for the future.
So here, at Tyburn Tree, this was where Jack Shepherd would face his execution on the 16th of November. Now, Tyburn Tree here wasn't actually a tree. It was one of the biggest gallows in London. In the time when London was still known as the City of Gallows, just because hangings were so popular around here. And he would have come from down that end, down from Oxford Street, what was called Oxford Road at that time, all the way from Newgate and the Old Bailey. He would be ferried along this old Roman road before he finally got to here. Now, when he got to here, after his several failed attempts at escape, he took up to the stand on the gallows. Whereas many spent that time to prove their innocence or to denounce God or have an angry rant at the authorities that got them there, Jack simply advertised for his pamphlet and for his autobiography. And part of that was due to Daniel Defoe and Appleby that were publishing his autobiography, which was probably ghostwritten by Defoe as well. So it's probably more likely that it was a biography more than anything. So we stand here and we say, "You'll find my confession in here." And he even managed to sign a few books and pamphlets before he got up, like he was a proper rock star, gathered around with loads of people here to see his hanging. Now, at this time, this was before the automatic drop was introduced, so hanging was woefully inefficient, and it took a long time for people to get strangled, so it was a really painful affair. When the automatic drop was there, you would break your neck, but at this time, you would be slowly strangled to death, which is really painful, and he would have been conscious for a good while. The problem with Jackal was that he was also very slight, so it took even longer for him to die, or come close to dying. Now, when he was hanging, lots of people came over, they pulled in his leg, they beat his chest, and they tried to make him expire more quickly. And after the allotted time of 15 minutes, a hearse came up that Daniel had orchestrated to come and pick up Jack. The idea was to bring his body in that hearse to a physician and warm him up with warm blankets and open a vein, and it was believed that you could resuscitate people that had been hung through that. So that was the plan. Unfortunately, the crowd wasn't in on that plan, and they mistook the hearse for being a carriage to bring him away to be anatomized, which was something many people, many working class people and criminals dreaded at the time, to be cut up for anatomical experiments. So the crowd mistook this, and they started attacking the hearse and throwing stones at the hearse, and they tried to pull the body away from the people that Defoe had gathered. And in this melee, Jack's body was ripped apart to shreds, and any chance of reviving him was out the window. Now, when things had died down here, his friends could finally come, pick up his corpse, and after a few more difficult events of being hassled, they finally managed to bring it to St. Martin's in the Field in current-day Trafalgar Square. And that's where he's lying to this day.
While Jack was a competent escape artist, he clearly made it easy for his captors to get him. It is debatable how subtle or competent he was as an actual thief, but his quick wit and craftsman skills often got him out of trouble until his luck finally ran out. Only 2 weeks later, the first pantomime inspired by his life, called The Harlequin Shepherd, opened in Theatre Royal Drury Lane. In the coming years, other plays and operas would feature in London, heavily inspired by his life, the most famous one being John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, staged in 1728. Shepherd inspired the character of Captain Macheath, and his nemesis, Peacham, was drawn from Jonathan Wild. It has been called the most popular play of the 18th century.